from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Hello and good evening, everybody. Welcome to this brand new episode, sponsored today by Hachette Learning. We have with us authors Tracey Smith and Barnaby Lenon, who are going to be talking with us about their new book. Stay with us. Let me just tell you first about Hachette Learning. We partner, Teachers Talk Radio partners with Hachette Learning. Hachette Learning publishes professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit www.hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles. So, with me today, I'm here with my co-host, Huma, Mirza, authors Tracey Smith and Barnaby Lenon. Let's find out, first of all, Tracey, Barnaby, tell us about yourselves.
Hello, good evening. So yes, my name is Tracey Smith, and I've been working in education for the past 33 years. I started off my career as a primary teacher. I taught all the way through from nursery through to year 6, went into leadership and became a head teacher in various schools in Oxfordshire, a very small village primary school, a school in an estate, and then a school in the centre of Oxford, which I took over when it was in special measures with Ofsted, and I've been exec head of 2 primaries as well. And I've been working for the last 5 years in teacher training specifically. So that's me.
That is impressive. Barnaby, what about you?
Hello, everybody. Yeah, so I was a teacher for 40 years. I taught at Eton, at Sherborne School in Dorset. I was the deputy head of Highgate School in London. Then I was the head of Trinity School in Croydon, and I was the head of Harrow School in Northwest London for 12 years. Then when I retired from doing that job, I helped set up a free school in the East End of London, the London Academy of Excellence. I was on the board of Ofqual for 6 years during the period of extensive reform to exams and the curriculum after 2010. And I'm currently the Dean of Education at the University of Buckingham, where we have about 1,400 students every year. And that's where I met Tracey.
So we're here today to talk about your book, Introduction to Teaching, Making Teacher Training Work. And Huma and I, we both think that this is a very interesting book, really amazing book, because both of us, we've seen so many young people go through teacher training. And there's so much one could say about it, isn't it? You're looking at it from the outside in, and you're thinking, oh, well, I should do that, or things. That's not on, we should change certain things. So we're here to talk about your book. And the first thing we'd like to hear from you is, what inspired you to write this book, Introduction to Teaching, and how did the idea for the collaboration emerge?
Well, the idea for the collaboration emerged because I'd spent most of my life teaching secondary age pupils, and Tracey had spent her life teaching primary age pupils. And one of the things that we think about teacher training is that there's a difference between primary schools and secondary schools. And sometimes when the government publishes information, for example, they fail to make that distinction. And they often actually are talking about the way in which secondary aged teachers might behave, assuming that primary are going to be the same, which they're not. So that's why we collaborated. The reason that we wanted to write a book, well, I think there were two real reasons. One is that we believe in the value of books, of textbooks. I've been teaching teenagers most of my life, and I found, particularly at A level, that it's been very good if one has an excellent textbook which summarizes what it is they're meant to know. I like the idea of providing resources on paper rather than everything online, or even everything through lectures and PowerPoint presentations. It's just really good to have a book which summarizes everything. Now, in the past, it maybe was difficult to write a book which summarized everything, but over the last 5 years, the government has taken hold of the qualified teacher status, which is the main qualification that teachers have in England, and has spelled out the syllabus that they want taught based on 8 essential principles, which are called the teacher standards. And the government syllabus, which is called the core content framework, was altered, and a new version came in this September, so only last month. So now's a really good time to set it all down in an authoritative textbook, useful summaries of these 8 teacher standards, clearly explained. But it's better than just reading the government's own syllabus, because a syllabus is necessarily rather a limited thing. It's quite inadequate. So this is our opportunity to take the government syllabus, explain what it really means in the context of both primary and secondary schools. So that's why we're hoping it's going to be a great success.
I think for me as well, it was the idea of taking the teacher standards and the information that's laid out in the ITTECF and translating it into a user-friendly manual full of examples, really. So we've both very much drawn from experience of teachers that we've worked with, of situations that we've been in ourselves. And there are some, as you'll know, there are some very specific examples of ideas to try out in certain situations and things like that. When I finished my PGC training back in the 1990s, the training quality was quite lacking in quality, and once I was let loose in a school, I had no idea what I was doing. And so, that's a long time ago. We've moved dramatically in the opposite direction. But even so, I still feel that for for most people who are training, certainly it's a useful thing for them to be able to read.
I definitely like, just, if we're looking at the book as a whole, I definitely like how, you've put all the ideas together. And now that you say it, Tracey, that it's a manual, or it's supposed to be like a manual that, people can read and use with these hands-on tips. I remember as I was reading it, I was just so impressed by how you had, the differentiation with primary and secondary school. It's not many books that do that in one volume. What you need to know if you're teaching secondary, what, some tips or things you need to know for primary school. Where I work in Germany, we have, handbooks and books on, teacher education and about teaching, but they're always separate books. And as I was reading that, I felt that the genre just seemed so familiar. And when you mentioned manual like that, the penny dropped there. Huma, would you like to add something here, or should we just dive straight into the book?
let's dive straight into the book.
Okay. So what I'm really interested in is this concept of good teaching or great teaching. We talk about it a lot. I talk about it in my classes. There's books about good teaching, or I think I have one in my office called What Great Teachers Say. And I know that in your book you mentioned that we should avoid, generalizations on what good teaching is. But really, in today's context, can we define good teaching?
Well, I think we can all spot a good teacher when we see them. We know that good teachers tend to have good subject knowledge, and that is true at both primary and secondary level, because teachers with good subject knowledge are much more interesting and very often more enthusiastic, and they're much more able to stretch and stimulate pupils. So that's something we're always looking for. And I think we're looking for teachers who have a strong enough character in order to maintain good control, because if their class is not under control, frankly, nothing much else can really be achieved. But we also are looking for teachers who are fundamentally warm people beneath the exterior. They're energetic, and they're enthusiastic, and their enthusiasm rubs off on their pupils. That's quite important. They have a good sense of humor, which pupils hopefully will appreciate. They have high expectations of their pupils, and they're ambitious for all of them. That seems to me pretty important. They're willing to work really hard. I think I can't think of any good teachers I know who don't work hard. They're quite good at organization. They know from experience what sort of things work in the classroom and what things don't work. They're patient when dealing with pupils. Pupils look to them for help, and they're willing to give help. These are the characteristics that we can all observe of good teachers. But I think what we say in the book is that there's no one model of a good teacher. You can identify these characteristics, but different teachers behave in very different ways and are capable of getting equally brilliant results.
Barnaby, I just want to ask, one thing that really sort of jumped out in chapter 1 was, the age-old debate of, are good teachers born or made? And you just said that you can spot a good teacher. I agree. But do you think that this kind of mindset sort of actually undermines the profession? I just feel that it's almost suggesting that teaching is a talent that you're born with, rather than a craft that you can refine. What are
That's
your
a great
views
question.
on
I'm
this?
going to hand over to Tracey.
Of course.
It's a good one, yeah.
So great teachers can be made. It helps if they like children. You can always tell if a teacher is happy in the company of children. So I think as long as that is a prerequisite, then great teachers can be made. I will give an example of myself. So I've already said that when I left teacher training college, I had no clue what I was doing. I ended up teaching in a very small village primary school where there was only me and the head teacher. And I was teaching reception to year 3, and I had literally no idea what I was doing. It was the days before phonics. It was the days before we had schemes. It was, there was nothing there for me to draw upon. And I spent 5 years being probably the worst teacher that I've ever experienced. I had no idea what I was doing. After 5 years, I moved to a larger school, and I was fortunate in having a parallel teacher who was highly experienced. And I was teaching year 5 and 6, and she was teaching year 5 and 6. And every opportunity that I could get, I would go and pop into her classroom. And so it would mean if I was shaving half an hour off my PPA time, if I was leaving my pupils to read quietly with a teaching assistant, I would pop in and see, and her name is Ellie Parry, and she's not even mentioned in the book, but I learned by watching Ellie what being a good teacher looked like, and I was able from that moment on to really refine and hone my craft. And within a couple of years, I became the teacher in that school that people were being told to go and observe. So I believe that with the commitment, the right opportunities to observe, the right kind of excellence, then teachers can be made.
I absolutely agree. And, I've had a similar experience after I completed my teacher training and I stepped into the classroom for the very first time. I don't think the first year I was a very great teacher, but I learned from my mentors, and I was very fortunate to be trained by a very experienced teacher, and she was phenomenal. Just watching her teach, it helped me improve and refine my craft. And over the years, last year I've worked under the leadership of a very, very fantastic head teacher. Her name is Deirdre Devine, and learned so much from her. She inspired me to step into leadership. So I think, it's a profession that you can refine your skill. You don't have to be super talented to step into teaching. You just need to have the passion to become a great teacher, and constantly reflect on your teaching practice, your leadership skills. There is always room for improvement, and I think that is what makes a good teacher, in my humble opinion. Not sure if you agree, but
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And actually, I work quite closely with mentors as well, and I often say to them, a mentor can be the difference between somebody becoming a great teacher or failing as a teacher. The skill and the importance of expert mentoring can't be underestimated.
Thank you.
And so if we look at the literature on teacher training, what are some of the gaps in teacher training and the literature on teacher training did you feel were most pressing or underaddressed, and to what extent does this book respond to these gaps in the literature?
Well, I'll let Tracey respond to that question in a moment. But what I would say, and that is, we tried to cover everything. So we tried to cover every aspect of the teacher's standards, which are the syllabus for the qualified teacher status course. But we also tried to cover things which are not in the teacher standards or in the core content framework, even though I think they should be. So I'll give a few examples. As a secondary school teacher, one of the most important things is to know how you might go about getting good exam results with your pupils. That is not directly covered in the ITT ECF. And so we wrote quite a bit about that. And I was speaking this morning to a group of people exactly on that topic, how to get good GCSE and A-level results. And then there were other things which are sometimes just not covered in teacher training, like what should you do if you're covering a lesson for someone else, or how should you prepare a teacher if they're going to cover your lesson? How should you go about organizing a school trip? What are the things that can easily go wrong? That and hundreds of other important topics which are just frankly not normally covered in teacher training. Now, of course, it's only a book, and a book can only take you so far. And as Tracey and I fully agree, you have to try these things out in a school, and you have to have a certain amount of experience in a school to understand precisely what the text that we've written is saying. But for anyone who's engaged in teacher training and are combining experience in the classroom with reading the relevant bits in our book, I think they'd find they got quite a long way. But I'm going to let Tracey answer the question now about, what topics does she think that we addressed, which are sometimes not addressed.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the angle that I'm particularly proud of and was really intending to get across at the outset of writing this book was examples, everyday examples. So rather than sitting in an office or in my ivory tower, saying this is what the framework says and means, I wanted it to be specific examples from people that I was spending my days with, people whose lessons I was constantly going into. There's one section where I think it's called Be More Ella, and it's just giving an example of an early career teacher. She was in her very first few months, and how she mastered the relationship with parents of the 5-year-old pupils that she was teaching. That she at the beginning, they were disconcerted that she was a newly qualified teacher, that she looked 20, 21, and she really won them over with the way that she spoke to them about her, about her pupils, and asked the parents for their input. And I just felt, seeing her in action, I just thought, this is the kind of, passing this kind of thing on to people. I'm not talking about me who's been teaching for 30 years. I'm talking about somebody who's just worked out that that's a really good thing to do, and it's having a really good impact. So I think I haven't read a book about teacher training that has those kinds of everyday, that's quite a particular example, but that has those sorts of, from the frontline examples, if you like, people that are doing it really well, and that possibly 6 months previously had never thought that they'd be able to do it. So it's just a question of, offering answers. As Barnaby said, we're not saying this is the only book that. I think it does fill a gap. I think it definitely fills a gap on offering those kinds of ideas for certain situations and certain different classes.
Okay. And before we go into a deep dive of the chapters, if you could narrow down, from all the topics that you've addressed in the book, which do you think is the hardest for new teachers to master, and why?
I think in a secondary school, one of the hardest things is if you're teaching a class of, say, 30 pupils with a wide range of ability, how are you going to stretch the most able and support the weakest pupils in the class without having a very fragmented approach to any individual lesson? There isn't a very great answer to that. I mean, it's something that skillful teachers gradually master from experience. So I would say it's very hard for new teachers to master differentiation.
Yeah, definitely. In Germany, it's such an important topic in teacher training and teacher education. So I teach English language. My students are going on to become teachers of English as a foreign language or / second language in German public schools. And in all the German textbooks, there's all this thing about, differentiation, do this and do that. If your students are, weaker, and if your students are strong, this is what you could do. But the concepts, my students struggle with the concepts behind differentiation, and also with the time issue, and including differentiation in their lesson planning. They do struggle with that. And my students have very little classroom experience. So whatever they're introduced to during their time at university just seems so foreign to them. It's all, theoretical. Many of them have only experienced teaching as a student, right? That the apprenticeship of observation that Lordy talks about, in terms about teaching. So they can't really grasp or connect, what they're supposed to do. Tracey.
Well, if you want me to choose one thing, that's a bit difficult. I think we'll go on to talk about certain other things that I feel are important. But for me, I think the one most difficult thing potentially for new teachers to master is asking questions well. So it's that aspect of AFL, assessment for learning. They're all very good at asking people to write the answers on a whiteboard and showing and being able to assess understanding. But for me, it's those questions about it's a very simple question. How do you know? How do you know that? So if it's in a mathematics or science or English, anything, how do you know? How do you know? How did you give that answer? Can you explain it? Can you explain your thinking there? And then building upon that, did anybody else think something different? Or can anybody build upon that answer? That kind of bouncing it around the class, this sort of open dialogue around thinking, I think is something that people find, I think they feel it's a minefield, whereas what I say to my trainees is just get into the habit of saying, how do you know? How did you reach that answer? And then all the others will kind of flow from that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to
go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to sort of touch on chapter 5, where you have referenced Professor Rob Coe's research. And he has identified several poor proxies of learning. For instance, when leaders go into a classroom to do a learning walk, a lesson could look really good without the pupils actually learning much. So could you tell our listeners a little bit more about Coe's work and what were his findings?
Yeah, so what he was interested in is how much knowledge have the pupils that he's watching got in their heads. Okay. How much have they actually learnt and remembered? So you can look at a class and you can see they're all quite busy writing away. They may be actually quite engaged and quite interested and asking questions and getting attention from the teacher and getting feedback. Or the classroom could be very well ordered and calm and under control, which would be good. And he could look at pupils' books and see that the curriculum has been covered. That's a really good thing. All the topics have been covered. And maybe some of the students could supply correct answers to questions, even if they hadn't fully understood what they were saying, or even though they might have forgotten the knowledge by next week. And so what he felt was, and I'm sure this is true, it's perfectly possible to observe a lesson, see the pupils working away and answering questions, but if you were to actually test them in a week's time or a month's time, they wouldn't know much. It hadn't sunk in. It wasn't in their memory. And so that wasn't such a good lesson after all. What he had observed were poor proxies for learning. But the teacher had failed to demonstrate that they really did know the work that they were being taught. That was what Rob Coe stated.
And I think,
do you think then, sorry, Tracey, do you think then this is where retrieval practice steps in? So before the start of every lesson, I think teachers should engage in retrieval practice. And this is one of Tom Sherrington's ideas. And I think it works well. So I think, how can then leaders go into a classroom and know for certain that retrieval practice is taking place? What should we teach our ECTs to be doing in a lesson observation to prove that learning is actually taking place?
Well, there's only one way, and that is in a secondary school anyway. I mean, Tracey can talk about primary schools, but in a secondary school, you've got to test the pupils, and that could mean you're just asking them informal questions, or you could ask them to write an answer on a mini whiteboard, or you could actually give them a proper formal test every, let's say, 2 weeks, for the sake of argument, on the work that had been covered in the previous 2 weeks. And you could, if you were inspecting lessons, ask to see the teacher's mark book and see what, how many marks they've collected in the last 6 weeks and whether they have been testing them. I mean, that's the only way. So it is.
And don't you think some people will complain and think this is? Don't you think that some teachers or parents will complain that this is all about testing? It's turning into a testing culture.
Yeah, okay. It all depends. It all depends what you think the purpose of testing is. So if you're testing just simply because you're sort of sadist, or you think it's a good thing to test for the sake of it, then that will be a fair criticism. But I'm not testing for that reason. I'm testing because I'm trying to force my teenage pupils to commit the work that I'm trying to teach them to memory. I want to see it in their long-term memory, because that's what education is. And if children leave our schools, whether it's a primary school or a secondary school, they've had a great time, they've had some good teachers, but they haven't actually committed anything to their memory, then we have failed.
So in the primary school, in the primary classroom, that would look more like low stakes testing at the start and the end of a lesson, maybe some sort of exit ticket type thing at the end of the lesson. I've seen one of the schools that I was head of, and I can't claim this for myself because it was already in place when I got there, but something called Flashback 4 at the start of every maths lesson. It would be 4 questions. One, something that we learnt yesterday, something we learnt last week, something we learnt last term, something we learnt last year. And the pupils work them out themselves. You go through them together, you go through misconceptions together. But it's a really, really good way of doing that kind of spaced retrieval practice as well, so that, over a course of time, you're still returning to the concepts that they've been learning about. So,
I absolutely agree with that, because I've used those types of questions. We call them the diagnostic questions for our year 6s, where we give them 4 questions and then, address any misconceptions that they have. That's a great way to test their knowledge. Yeah. So thank you. Yes.
Just to jump in here, one thing that my, teacher candidates do complain about is how little time they have in the day, or in, whichever period they're teaching, to do that, even that informal testing, because their curriculum is so packed. And they feel that, just, spending, say, 10 minutes at the beginning of a lesson or 10 minutes at the end, that takes a chunk out of their already packed lesson plan, because they've got to tick the boxes and they've got to do, meet the lesson objectives for that week, for that month, or they won't get through the syllabus. What do you say to that?
Well, I think, Khanh, you've just described one of the greatest weaknesses of the teaching in this country, and that is rushing through a syllabus, leaving half the pupils behind, failing to determine whether they've understood or even learnt the work that you've given them. And that's why we adopted maths mastery techniques, particularly from Singapore, the idea that we should go more slowly, teach things properly, and ensure that every pupil in the class has understood it. So I can understand the complaint, but the problem is caused by let's say, school leaders or exam board syllabuses that are too crammed with information.
I must have missed that in Singapore because I grew up in Singapore and my math is terrible. So I must have missed that memo. But it must be a universal then problem because, we have that in Germany as well. This, squash as much as you can in the syllabus. They've got to have, achieve this and these and these learning objectives by the end of the academic year.
I think for me, it's a question of there's a really good book. I shouldn't be advertising somebody else's book. There's a brilliant book called Teaching Backwards by Mark Burns and Andy Griffith, and it talks about you start with the end in mind. So you start with a learning intention for that lesson in mind, and you work out backwards how you're going to make sure all the pupils achieve that learning intention. And we used to take it to the extreme in one of my schools where I would say to my teachers, you do not let them leave the room until they have achieved that learning intention, learning objective. And so it was a question of making sure that progress was visible throughout the course of a lesson, even if it was a half an hour lesson. But I saw great practice the other day in a student. She was teaching diary writing, elements of diary writing to her for year fives. And at the end, as a kind of an exit ticket, she asked them to jot down on Post-it notes different aspects of diary writing, and they all popped it all on the board. And when they come into that next lesson tomorrow, that will be the first thing. They go back to that retrieval practice of that. They've got it up as a working wall that they can refer to after they've done the low stakes test. And I think that kind of trying to join the end of one lesson onto the start of the next lesson is quite a good way of bridging some of that sort of time issue that we have.
Yeah, I mean, that what you mentioned, backward design, that's one of the models of instructional design anyway. You design with, the end in mind, and then, how you plan your lesson, how do you plan to get there, what are the tools you want to use, what are the materials and the resources. And there are many ways to engage in retrieval practice. There's, graphic organizers, KWL charts. Huma, it's back to you about well-structured lessons. I think we segued really well into that, from backward design into well-structured lessons.
I was going to ask, it's something that I read in chapter 2, actually, so I'm going backwards, sorry. In your book, you emphasize that training must be practice-rich and rooted in real classrooms. And often we see that, teacher training programs often get it wrong. And there's so many trainees that say that the academic side of ITT feels a little bit detached from what they see in schools. So how do we bridge that gap?
I think that, so we're both speaking from Buckingham's point of view, but our teacher apprenticeship, our PGCE, and other courses that are based in SCITS, school-centred initial teacher training, are all based in the classroom, based in the school, within the school that you're employed. And I think that makes that transition much, much easier. It's a long time since I've had experience of a teacher training course that doesn't have that sort of in situ element to it, and that unfortunately that was the way I was trained, and I don't know the answer to that. I don't know whether Barnaby does.
Well, I think the emphasis these days is less on theories, which might after all have been written hundreds of years ago, and more on contemporary research findings. And what the government has been very keen for us to do through the qualified teacher status course is to ensure that whatever we say to students is backed up by evidence of recent research from somewhere in the world. And that's exactly what we do. I think that's more satisfactory. But, at the University of Buckingham, we believe mainly in learning by doing, by going into a classroom, trying it out, having your lesson observed and having good feedback.
Yes, and I think that's the best way to go about it. But then thinking about subject knowledge and curriculum design, how can mentors and leaders create a space for training teachers to develop subject mastery rather than just, surviving in lessons? So obviously when ECTs come into school, they don't know it all. And it then falls on the mentors and the leaders' shoulders to give them that opportunity to develop subject knowledge. So how do you think that should be happening in schools?
Well, I just think that all teachers, primary and secondary, should be devoting a good proportion of their time to developing their subject knowledge. I mean, personally, I spend a lot of time in school holidays reading around my subject, and I was happy to do that. On our teacher training course, the qualified teacher status course only requires you to teach or be in a classroom for 15 hours a week. So you've got, a lot of time. If you're only doing 15 hours a week in the classroom, you've got a lot of time to do something else. And much of that can be researching your subject, reading around your subject. One of the whole points of the early career framework, your first 2 years as a qualified teacher, is that you get a reduced timetable. So again, you're being given time. What are you going to do with that time? You're going to develop your subject knowledge. I mean, in our course at Buckingham, we give them a lot of talks about their subject. So, it's not left entirely to them, but nevertheless, we all know that you may have read history at Oxford, but when you come to teach history A-level for the first time, you're probably going to be teaching a topic that you never studied at Oxford. So you've got to start building up your subject knowledge. That should be one of the most enjoyable things about being a teacher, that you want to do that, you're pleased to do it, and you do it.
I would have thought, I would have thought that the onus was on you. The onus was on the teacher to develop their subject knowledge beyond what they've already been introduced to at university.
Yes. That's why we've written a textbook, because we need them to develop their knowledge of pedagogy and of the teaching standards. And what better way than reading about it in a book?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you were to give new teachers one piece of advice about curriculum design, what would it be?
Oh, for me, it would be, can I step in, Barnaby, or would you like to go first on the back of what you've just said?
No, you go. You go, Tony.
Curriculum design. I'm slightly altering the line, I think, here, but I get very distressed at the moment about created schemes of work and lessons, and when I walk into a school and somebody's uploaded a PowerPoint they've never looked at before, it makes me want to weep when, and it's number 6 in the series of the RE lessons that they're teaching on Judaism, and they haven't checked the subject knowledge that they're teaching, and they don't know what slide's coming next. Because I know, obviously we've mentioned AI in the book as well, and how that can be used for planning lessons. And I had a teacher reflecting the other day and saying, the PE lesson was too boring. The PowerPoint was, a bit flat. And I said to them, I said, you've got to go through it beforehand. You've got to go through the material. You've got to adapt it for the needs of your class. And I do worry very much about the fact that schools are buying in schemes of work for every subject and taking that thrill away from teaching. My favourite thing would be, I had to teach the Greeks. I knew nothing about the Greeks, so I'd learn about the Greeks. I loved all of that. And I do worry that it's all becoming a little bit mechanized.
It's taking also.
Sorry. Go ahead.
It takes the creativity away from teaching, I think. My own teacher candidates, they do also go in with that attitude. They, I do lesson planning with them. I work on, grammar activities. I show them how, you could look at a textbook and plan for yourself, decide for yourself, if I had a class of 30 kids, what would I do, etc. And many of them, roll their eyes at me and say, well, we've got the teacher's book. And the teacher's book, like you say, it's pre-prepared. It tells you what to do, and you have all that add-on, tech, audio, visual materials, and it, teacher's book says, play this video and all that. But I find that all that is generic, and that's what I tell my students. I say it's generic, and you need to. Part of teacher competences is being able to improvise, to be spontaneous, to tweak a lesson to the audience that you have. Of course, for my teacher candidates, because they're at university, that audience is so far removed from their present reality. But that notwithstanding, they have the strong belief that they can conquer teaching with their course book and their teacher's handbook. And I feel quite sad because, teaching is being creative,
Exactly. And Tracey, you mentioned AI, and
Yes.
you've mentioned AI in the book as well. So when I was training as a teacher, we didn't have AI tools to use to create lessons and resources. And these days, teachers have access to many different AI platforms to create those resources. With lesson planning becoming so quick and easy, I just feel that we are in danger of creating teachers who depend too much on these tools, and they're becoming passive teachers rather than, active thinkers. You've just mentioned creativity. I feel that they're losing their own creativity. They're depending, entirely on these tools to help them create a lesson without using their pedagogical knowledge to create that lesson for the students.
Yes, I
So
agree. Sorry, carry on, Huma.
what is your take on this? Sorry, I know I've got very old-fashioned views.
No, I
Some new
totally
teachers
agree
might
with
not agree with me.
it does mention in the book how easy lesson planning is if you use something like, for example, the Oak National Academy, the AI tools to create a whole scheme of work. And I've got a trainee who's in a school where they've wholeheartedly bought into that. And she was asking me, and she was saying, how do you feel about the fact that, I'm now given the lessons I have to teach? And I said to her, we were talking about neurodiverse students as well, and I said, you have to adapt it for the needs of your class, not the class as a whole, but also the class as individuals as well. But it also runs the risk of being tedious as well. So I observed a lesson the other day, sorry to keep going on about examples, but I think it's relevant. It was a year 2 lesson, and the pupils were classifying animal groups. They were really good. If they had feathers, they must be birds. If they they were reptiles, they were amphibians. And the teacher was using this scheme, and it was like little cartoon characters of arthropods and reptiles, and I just said to her afterwards, I said, I wonder what would have happened if every time you introduced a different type of animal species, if you'd have just showed a 30-second clip from a David Attenborough documentary of how they move and how they, live in their and she said, oh, what a really good idea. I'll have to think about doing that. And I just worry that we're losing that kind of natural inclination to think about how to make things more relevant and exciting and memorable as well.
And I think it's also mentioned in the book that AI is also being used to write assessments and even mark English essays, or, I suppose the English essays be at a secondary school level or even at university level. Now, that sounds very efficient, but to me, it's a little bit unsettling. So if I was a student at uni and I'm writing my dissertation, I wouldn't want AI to mark my work. I think we are at a risk of losing that human judgment, which is so, so vital when giving, feedback to students. So you both are working in a university and you've been a secondary school teacher. What is your take on this?
Well, I don't really agree with you. I think that it's perfectly possible to design AI so that it marks English essays or anything else you like just as well as a human being. And if that's true, then it will save a huge amount of time. It means that, public exams particularly can be marked quickly and more reliably than human beings. So I think you've overstated it. On the other hand, of course, it's important for the teacher to know what the individual students can and can't do. So although AI may do the marking, there's still a job to be done by the teacher to analyze what it is that's gone well and what's gone wrong. And AI can help with that as well. I've got no problem with AI writing assessments, which was the other point you made. I think that's perfectly possible. So I distinguish between this and the thing you were talking about 3 minutes ago, and that is delivering a lesson, where I completely agree with everything you've said about teachers having autonomy over the way they deliver their lesson, and that teachers have to own the knowledge and really put themselves into the lesson in a way you could never do if you were just taking a lesson out of a catalogue.
Thank you, Barnaby. That was a very good answer, and I like people disagreeing with me. And that comes to another big question that I have. Do you think AI will reach a point where it sort of replaces the teacher role? We're already using it for marking and many other things, planning, for instance. Do you think it will replace parts of the teacher role or the teacher role itself?
Well, it might replace part of it in the way I've just described, but I don't think it will replace much of it. I mean, personally, I think that teaching is one of the professions and jobs least likely to be eroded by AI, because, the experience of COVID, where we tried online learning and so on, was that pupils needed people, individual teachers. And that's one of the great things about a school, is the relationship between the teachers and the pupils and their interaction, which cannot be replicated by AI. So I'm perfectly happy for AI to take some of the tedious jobs on, but I don't think that as long as we don't outsource teaching to a robot, I don't think that AI represents too much of a threat to us, actually, no.
Okay, thank you.
And I mean, there've been other studies, or there's been a lot of work done on classroom interaction anyway, that says, learning happens when there's classroom interaction. And, genuine classroom interaction can only, well, I hope I'm not wrong, but really can only happen among humans. The robot can't really have that classroom interaction with you. I mean, there has been, I know that in language teaching, particularly in language testing and assessment, they have tried to, devise interactive language assessments using generative AI, right, where the bot will say something and the student will have to respond. But the challenge with that is feeding into the program all the possible responses that you think the student might say, and then you can then tick it off. So I think we're still a very long way for that, because human nature and how we interact with each other, it's not always predictable. we do have 5 minutes, and I'm going to let you pick something, Huma, something with which we can, finish off with a bang, so to speak.
Okay, so one of my other questions was, and this was one of my favorite sections in the book, was managing behavior and training our new teachers to manage behavior. And there was a mention of silent signals, and I got really excited because I use them in my class. And they're such a fantastic way of managing behavior. So do you think these small routines make a big difference in classroom management, especially for new teachers? I know it worked for me.
Yes, I do. I do. I mean, having seen it working with 3-4-year-olds up to 11, 12-year-olds and beyond, I think it's a really, really useful way of working. I think we talk about the adults modelling consistency, Kuldix, and it's a really good way of adults being able to sort of model self-regulation and composure and quiet, and the pupils really, really pick up on that sort of thing. Obviously, it reduces disruption, so pupils move around the class silently, usually, if it's done well. It's quick, it's done, there's no time wasted, it's consistent. They're non-confrontational kinds of ways of getting pupils to do things, because there's kind of an acceptance that that's what they'll do. So I think it's that kind of modeling of emotional control is really, really really powerful. So the kind of things Huma's referring to is things like the 3-2-1 hand signal.
Yes.
So 1, 2, 3, stand up silently, move to your chair silently, sit down silently, and then do the reverse. Those sorts of things, really, really powerful, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
I learned the silent signals when I was learning how to teach phonics, and we used them for read writing.
Yeah.
And it was really effective, and I've always used the silent signals in my class.
Really
I
good.
also wanted to quickly mention, yes, talking partners. Great. Just very quickly, I also wanted to mention that you have referenced research around low-level disruption in class. And I feel that these, small behaviors and low-level disruption is something that sort of chips away on learning the most. So do you think sometimes schools underestimate the damage that low-level disruption does in the classroom? And how do we tackle it without creating a culture of fear?
So it's a two-part answer, really. So first of all, yes, schools do underestimate the impact of it, because it stops other pupils from being able to focus, concentrate. It affects their cognitive load. First of all, I think you need to remove any kind of antecedents. Making sure that there's no opportunities for the pupils to mess about in the corridor or start talking, give the books out before the lesson, all those kinds of things, rather than have that kind of hubbub going on whilst you're trying to teach them. I say to my students, you don't speak to the class until they're all silent and waiting for what you're going to say. And I think, I've been in most of our schools, we didn't reward, we rewarded with praise, so specific praise. And, there's that magic, well done, Leanne, I can see you're doing exactly what we've asked you to do. That obviously works a treat, that your teachers themselves. But also, I think just stepping into, I think if we'd have had more time, maybe talking a bit more about restorative approaches as well. I think I'm a big advocate. So I will also do some work with values-based education. And I'm a big advocate for teaching through values, teaching ethical vocabulary to pupils, giving them that kind of sort of moral compass, I suppose. So I think if you talking about restorative behaviour, if you've got warmth without consistency, that leads to chaos. If you've got consistency without warmth, that leads to compliance, you know. And I think it's that kind of bringing together that trust, safety, genuine cooperation, helping pupils to understand where they've gone wrong, how they can put it right, all those kinds of things. You know, for me, it's all about it's relationships first, but not at the cost of accountability and good behaviour.
Okay, because that was my next question, and I know you've touched upon it, because I work in West Yorkshire, and we use the therapeutic thinking approach. And while I see the value in it, and the fact that we teachers need to understand the pupils' emotions and build relationships, I sometimes worry that we are sort of overcomplicating behavior management, or I could say sort of making excuses for behavior at times. So when we're becoming empathetic and more understanding towards our students, sometimes I think we are letting go of holding our pupils, and even sometimes teachers, accountable for their actions. So, Tracey, I know you may disagree with me, but could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, of course. I'll go first, and then I'm sure Barnaby's got views that are slightly different from mine. But I think, you know, I agree that that we need to be understanding. You know, I believe in trauma-informed practice. I believe in understanding neurodiversity and not making allowances for it necessarily in terms of behaviour expectations, but certainly adapting teaching routines and having, you know, various things in place for different pupils. However, I don't agree with excusing poor behaviour. And that's why I believe in the restorative approach, because in my experience, and I have had a lot of years of experience, if you explain to pupils why something's unacceptable and how they can go about putting it right, they will every time, with the right kind of conversation, they will want to do that. So I don't think that kind of understanding and empathy should come at the expense of any kind of high expectations for behaviour.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree.
Barnaby?
Well, I think all I can do is repeat one of the themes of the book, which is that there's a big difference between primary and secondary. And, you know, how you manage behaviour is not something I would personally wish to generalise about. It depends on the age of the pupils, and it depends on the nature of the class you're teaching. So I'm not going to argue with Tracey, but I don't think it applies at all times in all places.
Yeah. And I think that kind of encapsulates the book, really. There's certain chapters and sections of chapters where everything applies, whether it's primary or secondary, and then there's other things which are more specifically age related or subject specific as well. So yeah.
So I'm going to ask my final question, and that is, you both have dedicated your lives to shaping teachers. What keeps you both hopeful about the future of education?
Well, for me, it is that over the last 15 years, I have seen standards be rising across the board in all types of schools in England. And the quality of teaching now is far higher than it was 15 or 20 years ago. So I'm full of optimism for that reason. And you know, the statistics prove I'm right.
Yeah, and for me, it's that old adage that, you know, education has the power to change the world for the better, and I still believe that, you know, our children are our future, and that I do think something has to change. I do think that we're not enabling our children to be able to think critically enough at the moment. I think we're not enabling them to be able to make enough sort of decisions about the way that things are run. I'm not saying the children should be in charge, not by any means, but I think that we need to bring back into our curriculum a lot more opportunities for thinking, for questioning, for expanding those sorts of philosophical aspects of our lives that make everything so interesting and enriching. So that has to change first.
I mean, as long as we continue to be, reflective practitioners, I'm sure there is hope for the future. And as we close this show this evening, just a reminder, this show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, just recently published Introduction to Teaching, Making Teacher Training Work. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Level up your professional development and visit the website www.hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles and to get your very own copy of Introduction to Teaching, Making Teacher Training Work. And there you go, Huma, you have got it. Show us it. Beautiful colors. Come on, show us it again. Yeah, there it is. Okay. Wonderful book. Thank you very much. Wonderful conversation with Tracey and Barnaby. Thank you also to my co-host, Huma. And good night, everyone.
Good night.
Outstanding, world-class vision, world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.